The rain was coming down in sheets that night at the old dock, and I could barely see my father's face through the storm. But I didn't need to see it clearly to know the truth anymore. The journal in my hands, soaked and heavy, held every secret my mother had died protecting. And as my father lunged toward me, his hands reaching for that evidence like it was his lifeline, I realized this was the moment everything would either end or begin. He slipped. The dock was slick with rain and seawater, and Robert Dawson, the man who had stolen everything from my mother, who had built an empire on her broken dreams, lost his footing. I watched him fall backward into the churning black water below. The waves were massive that night, fed by the storm, and they swallowed him whole. My brother Mason screamed a sound I'll never forget, but neither of us moved to help. Maybe we couldn't. Maybe we didn't want to. If you're finding this story gripping so far, please hit that like button and subscribe. I promise you this is just the beginning of how I discovered my mother's truth and rebuilt everything they tried to destroy. Drop a comment below telling me if you've ever had to fight for justice in your own family. Now, let me take you back to where this all started. 3 months earlier, I stood alone at my mother's grave. The cemetery was cold, gray, unwelcoming, just like the rest of my life had been since I could remember. Evelyn Monroe Dawson was being buried, and not a single member of the Dawson family bothered to show up except me. My father Robert claimed he had important business meetings in Boston. My older brother Mason sent a text at 7 in the morning that simply said he couldn't make it. No explanation. No apology. Just another message in a lifetime of messages that told me I didn't matter enough. I was 28 years old, and I had spent every single one of those years being the daughter who wasn't wanted. The mistake. The burden. The reason my father had to send those monthly checks that always arrived late if they arrived at all. Mom and I lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of Portland, Oregon, where the walls were thin and the heating barely worked in winter. We survived on her seamstress income and those sporadic checks from my father. Meanwhile, Robert and Mason lived in a mansion in Beacon Hill running what they called the Dawson family business, a jewelry and luxury goods empire that I'd only ever seen in magazine spreads. I spent my childhood watching my mother work herself to exhaustion. She took in alterations, did custom sewing for wealthy clients, and sometimes worked 16-hour days just to keep us fed. She never complained. She never talked about my father except to say that their marriage was complicated. When I asked why we didn't live with him, why he never visited, why Mason never called, she would just get this distant look in her eyes and say that some things were better left in the past. I grew up thinking my mother was weak, that she'd gotten pregnant by a rich man who didn't love her, and she'd been too afraid or too proud to ask for more than the bare minimum. I resented her for it sometimes, especially during those years in high school when I had to work after-school jobs to help pay rent when I couldn't afford the clothes or the trips or the experiences my classmates took for granted. I was angry that she seemed to accept our situation, that she never fought for us. The funeral was small. Just me, the priest, and 2 of my mother's clients who had become something like friends over the years. Mrs. Chen, who owned a dry cleaning business, and Sarah Rodriguez, who taught at the community college. They hugged me, said kind words about my mother's talent and gentle nature, and then they left. The priest finished his prayers and departed, and I was alone. The wind picked up, carrying a bitter chill that cut through my thin black coat. I'd bought it at Goodwill the day before because I didn't own anything appropriate for a funeral. I was about to leave to drive back to the apartment that now felt impossibly empty without my mother's presence, when I heard footsteps behind me. A woman appeared, tall and elegant, wearing a black veil that completely obscured her face. She was dressed in an expensive-looking coat, and she moved with the kind of confidence that comes from money and education. Everything about her seemed out of place in this modest cemetery on the outskirts of Portland. She walked directly to me without hesitation, as if she knew exactly who I was. In her gloved hands, she held a small box, deep burgundy velvet worn at the edges, like something that had been hidden away for years. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but clear enough to hear over the wind. Your mother wanted you to have this after she was gone. It will change everything you thought you knew. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Who are you? How did you know my mother? She shook her head slightly. That doesn't matter right now. What matters is what's in this box. Your mother was my friend a long time ago. She asked me to do this for her if anything happened. I promised I would. Before I could ask anything else, before I could demand more answers, she turned and walked away. Her heels clicked on the cemetery path, and then she disappeared between the headstones like a ghost. I called out after her, but she didn't stop. Within seconds, she was gone, leaving me standing there with this mysterious box in my trembling hands. I sat in my car in that cemetery parking lot for over an hour. The box sat on the passenger seat and I just stared at it, afraid to open it. Part of me wanted to throw it away to drive home and forget this bizarre encounter. But a larger part of me, the part that had always wondered about the secrets my mother kept, needed to know what was inside. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter on cream-colored paper that had yellowed with age. My mother's handwriting, which I knew from birthday cards and grocery lists, covered both sides of the page. Beneath the letter was a small golden key, ornate and old-fashioned, with the initials EM engraved in elegant script. And at the bottom of the box, tucked under a layer of tissue paper, was a card with an address written in the same handwriting. The address was in Kennebunkport, Maine. I picked up the letter with shaking hands and began to read. My mother's words hit me like a physical blow, each sentence rewriting everything I thought I knew about her, about our life, about the woman I'd believed was too weak to fight for us. Harper, my darling daughter. You always thought I was weak, didn't you? I know you did. I saw it in your eyes, especially during those hard years when you were working so hard and I seemed to accept our poverty without complaint. But I need you to know something. I wasn't weak. I was surviving. I was protecting you. And I was waiting for the right moment to give you the tools to fight back. I couldn't do it while I was alive. Your father, Robert Dawson, is a dangerous man. He has money, power, and connections that reach into places I could never touch. If I had tried to expose him while I was still here, he would have destroyed me and probably taken you away just to punish me. He's done it before to others who tried to challenge him. But now I'm gone, and you're strong enough. You've always been so much stronger than you realized. You're a lion, Harper. You got that from me, even if you never knew it. The truth is in Kennebunkport. Everything you need to know, everything I gathered over the years, is waiting for you there. Use this key. Find the answers. And when you understand what he did, what he took from us, I need you to promise me something. Don't let him win. Don't let him bury the truth the way he buried me. Be the lion you were always meant to be. And never ever trust anyone in the Dawson family. I love you more than you'll ever know. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger for you while I was here. But I can give you this. All my love, Mom. I read the letter 3 times, then 4, then 5. Each time the words seemed to rearrange themselves in my mind, forming new questions, new terrors, new possibilities. My mother had kept secrets. Few life-changing secrets. And now she was trusting me to uncover them. The next morning I called in sick to my job at Powell's Books, where I worked part-time as a sales associate. I'd been there for 3 years, barely making enough to contribute to rent and groceries. My manager, Doug, was understanding but unenthusiastic about my vague excuse of a family emergency. I didn't care. I threw some clothes in a duffel bag, grabbed my laptop, my phone charger, and the little money I had in my checking account. Then I started the long drive from Portland to Kennebunkport. The drive took almost 2 full days. I couldn't afford to fly, and I didn't have a credit card with enough limit to rent a car one way. So I drove my mother's ancient Honda Civic, which had over 200,000 miles on it and made concerning noises whenever I went over 60 miles per hour. I stopped at cheap motels, ate at truck stops, and spent the hours on the road thinking about that letter, about the key, about what I might find. I kept glancing at that golden key on the passenger seat, picking it up at red lights, running my fingers over the engraved initials. M. Evelyn Monroe. My mother's maiden name. Why had she never used it? Why had she kept the Dawson name even though Robert had essentially abandoned us? The questions multiplied with every mile. What was in Kennebunkport? Why there? My father's company had offices in Boston, New York, and Los Angeles, but I'd never heard him mention Maine. Or had I? There was something tugging at the edge of my memory, something from childhood. Business trips. My father visiting once or twice a year, always briefly, always with the air of someone fulfilling an obligation. And hadn't he mentioned the coast? The ocean. By the time I reached Kennebunkport, it was late afternoon on the second day, and storm clouds were gathering over the Atlantic. The address led me away from the tourist areas, away from the pretty harbor and expensive boutiques, out to a more isolated stretch of coastline. The road became narrow and winding, climbing up rocky cliffs with the ocean churning below. I found the house hidden behind overgrown bushes, and a rusted iron gate that hung crooked on its hinges. The gate was locked, but the fence on either side was so deteriorated that I simply walked around it. The driveway was cracked, and weed-covered, and the house itself looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Weathered gray wood shutters hanging at odd angles, paint peeling in long strips. But it was solid, substantial, and the location was breathtaking despite the decay. Perched on the edge of a cliff with an unobstructed view of the ocean. My hands shook as I approached the front door. The wind off the Atlantic was fierce and cold, carrying the smell of salt and the sound of waves crashing against rocks. I pulled out the golden key, praying it would fit the lock. It did. The door swung open with a long creak, and I stepped inside. For a moment, I just stood there in the dim entryway, trying to understand what I was seeing. It wasn't an abandoned house. It wasn't even really a house in the traditional sense. The main living area had been converted into a workshop and showroom, and despite the dust and the stale air, it was clear that someone had once spent significant time here. The space was filled with professional-grade equipment workbenches covered with tools and display cases that must have once held finished pieces. I moved deeper into the space, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The walls were covered with sketches, hundreds of them pinned up in organized rows. Design sketches for jewelry pieces that were stunning in their complexity and artistry. Necklaces, bracelets, rings, earrings. Each one unique, each one showing a level of skill that took my breath away. On the main workbench, surrounded by small tools and magnifying glasses, I found raw gemstones. Emeralds, sapphires, rubies, even a few diamonds. They were organized in small containers, labeled with notes about color clarity and intended use. There were coils of gold and silver wire sheets of metal in various thicknesses, and a small furnace that must have been used for metalwork. Above the workbench, mounted on the wall like a business sign, were words in elegant script. Monroe Designs. My mother's maiden name. This was hers. This entire place, this workshop, this treasure trove of talent and artistry belonged to my mother. I stood there in shock, trying to reconcile the woman who had hemmed pants in our tiny apartment with the artist who had created this space. How had she afforded it? When had she worked here? Why had she never told me about it? I spent hours exploring every corner of that workshop. I opened drawers and found more sketches, notebooks filled with design ideas and technical specifications, and folders containing what looked like business documents. In one cabinet, I discovered completed pieces that had never been sold, each one wrapped carefully in soft cloth. I held a necklace up to the fading light from the windows and watched it sparkle. It was museum-quality work, the kind of piece that should have been in high-end galleries, not hidden away in an abandoned workshop. On the main workbench, prominently displayed as if it had been left there deliberately, I found a photograph in a tarnished silver frame. My mother, young and radiant, her face lit up with genuine joy. She was standing on a beach with the ocean behind her, and she was holding hands with a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't my father. Robert Dawson was tall and broad, with sharp features and dark hair he kept slicked back. This man was different. Younger looking, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He wore casual clothes, jeans, and a sweater, and the way he looked at my mother in the photograph made something ache in my chest. I turned the frame over, hands trembling, and found an inscription on the back. Evelyn and Richard Summer, 1995, our future begins. Richard, not Robert. And 1995, 2 years before I was born. I searched the workbench frantically, looking for more clues, more information. In the top drawer, I found another letter from my mother, this one longer, and written on pages that had been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases were starting to tear. I sat down in my mother's chair, the chair where she must have worked for countless hours, and I began to read. The story that unfolded in her words was so much darker and more complicated than I could have imagined. My mother had met Richard Dawson when she was 23, fresh out of art school with a degree in jewelry design and metalwork. Richard was 25, working in his family's business, but harboring dreams of starting something of his own. They met at an art exhibition in Boston, where my mother was displaying some of her early work. Richard had been immediately captivated by her talent. They fell in love quickly. Richard proposed the idea of starting a business together, combining her artistic vision with his business knowledge. They called it Monroe Designs, using my mother's name because Richard wanted to honor her as the creative force behind the company. They found this property in Kennebunkport, bought it together, and spent months renovating the house into a workshop. The business started small but grew quickly. My mother's designs were unique, sophisticated, appealing to wealthy clients who wanted something more artistic than what traditional jewelers offered. Richard handled the business side, securing contracts with galleries and boutiques up and down the East Coast. They were happy. They were successful. They were planning to get married. Then Robert Dawson entered the picture. Robert was Richard's older brother by 7 years, and according to my mother's letter, he was everything Richard wasn't. Aggressive, ambitious, ruthless in business. He'd built his own fortune in real estate and investment, and he had a reputation for taking what he wanted regardless of who got hurt in the process. When Robert heard about Monroe Designs through family conversations, he came to visit. My mother wrote that she disliked him, immediately found him arrogant and dismissive of her work. But Richard looked up to his older brother, wanted his approval, and was flattered when Robert expressed interest in helping the business expand. What happened next was calculated and devastating. Robert began visiting regularly, always with suggestions about how to grow the company, how to reach bigger markets, how to secure more capital for expansion. He was charming when he wanted to be, my mother admitted, and he knew how to make people feel like he had their best interests at heart. Richard started to rely on his advice more and more. Then Robert turned his attention to my mother. He complimented her work, praised her talent, made her feel seen and valued in ways that Richard's sweet but often distracted by business concerns sometimes forgot to do. My mother wrote that she was ashamed to admit it, but she'd been flattered by Robert's attention. She was young, ambitious, and Robert made her feel like she could become a major name in the jewelry world. The seduction was gradual. Robert started coming by when Richard wasn't there, bringing expensive wine and talking about opportunities. He made promises about connections. He had galleries in New York and Los Angeles that would showcase her work, investors who would pour money into Monroe Designs. All she had to do was trust him. My mother made her first mistake when she signed papers that Robert claimed were just formalities for expansion. She trusted Richard, and Richard trusted Robert. Neither of them read the documents carefully enough. Neither of them realized that Robert was systematically transferring ownership of Monroe Designs from a partnership between my mother and Richard to a corporation controlled by Robert himself. By the time my mother realized what was happening, it was too late. She was pregnant with me, and Robert had revealed his true intentions. He wanted Monroe Designs, he wanted her designs, and he wanted to cut both her and Richard out of the company they'd built. When my mother tried to fight back, Robert showed her just how much power he had. He had lawyers, connections, and money. He threatened to have her declared an unfit mother. He told her that if she didn't cooperate, she'd lose everything, including her baby. He pointed out that all the major contracts Monroe Designs had secured were now in his name, that the property in Kennebunkport was in his name, through clever legal maneuvering, that even the trademark for Monroe Designs had been transferred to him. Richard, my mother wrote, was devastated. He blamed himself for trusting his brother, for being blind to Robert's manipulation. He wanted to fight, wanted to go to the police, wanted to hire lawyers and sue Robert for fraud. But Robert had been too careful. Everything he'd done was technically legal, just barely, and he had the resources to drag out any legal battle for years. My mother was exhausted, pregnant, and terrified. She agreed to Robert's terms. She would keep her mouth shut about what had happened. She would marry him to give me legitimacy and avoid a scandal, and in exchange, Robert would provide financial support. She could keep the workshop in Kennebunkport, but she couldn't use it. Monroe Designs would continue, but under Robert's control, with hired designers creating pieces using her aesthetic but not her actual work. The marriage was a sham from the beginning. Robert moved my mother to a small apartment far from his mansion in Boston. He visited occasionally, usually when he needed something, but he made it clear that she and I were obligations, not family. When Mason was born a year later to a woman Robert was actually involved with, my mother realized she'd been a fool. Robert had used her to get what he wanted, and now she was trapped. The letter described years of quiet desperation. My mother couldn't work openly as a jewelry designer because Robert controlled the Monroe Designs trademark. She couldn't go public with the truth because he'd threatened to take me away. She couldn't divorce him because the prenuptial agreement she'd signed, another document she hadn't fully understood, left her with nothing. So she survived by doing alterations and seamstress work, living in poverty, while Robert built an empire on her stolen designs. But she never stopped documenting what he'd done. She kept copies of contracts, bank statements, emails, and letters. She recorded conversations when she could. She wrote everything down in journals, creating a record of Robert's fraud and manipulation that spanned decades. And Richard. The letter's tone changed when she wrote about Richard. He'd tried to help her, tried to gather evidence against Robert, tried to find a way to make things right. They met in secret, carefully, always afraid that Robert would find out. Richard was racked with guilt, unable to forgive himself for bringing his brother into their lives. 6 months after I was born, Richard told my mother he'd gathered enough evidence to go to the authorities. He had documentation of forgery fraud and illegal business practices. He was finally ready to take his brother down, even if it meant destroying the Dawson family name in the process. 2 weeks later, Richard Dawson was dead. The official story was that he'd gone out on his boat, had too much to drink, and fell overboard. His body was found 3 days later, washed up on a beach south of Portland. The police investigated briefly, decided it was an accidental drowning, and closed the case. My mother never believed it was an accident. Richard didn't drink heavily, and he was an experienced boater. The timing was too convenient. In her letter, she wrote that she was certain Robert had killed his own brother to protect his secrets. But she had no proof, no way to prove murder when the authorities had already ruled it accidental death. That's when my mother gave up fighting openly. She'd lost Richard, lost her business, lost her dreams. All she had left was me, and she would do anything to protect me. So she stayed quiet, raised me in poverty while Robert lived in luxury, and waited. She waited for me to grow up to become strong enough to fight battles she couldn't win. And she documented everything, hiding the evidence in this workshop, in this place that Robert probably didn't even remember existed because it had never mattered to him. It was just another piece of property, another asset on a long list. He'd never bothered to come here, never bothered to check what she'd left behind. The letter ended with instructions. In the hidden compartment under the floorboards, I would find her journals, years of documentation about Robert's crimes. In the safe behind the false panel in the bedroom closet, I would find the original contracts and financial records that proved he'd stolen Monroe designs. The combination was my birthday because I was the reason she'd fought to preserve the truth. Find the evidence, Harper. Understand what he did. And then decide if you're brave enough to make him pay for it. I couldn't do it while I was alive. But you can. You're stronger than I ever was. You're a lion, and it's time to roar. I sat in that workshop as the sun set and the storm clouds gathered, holding my mother's letter and crying for the first time since she died. I cried for her lost dreams, for the life she should have had for Richard, who'd tried to do the right thing and paid with his life. And I cried for myself for all the years I'd resented her weakness when she'd actually been the strongest person I'd ever known. Then I dried my tears and got to work. I found the hidden compartment exactly where she'd described it, under a loose floorboard beneath the workbench. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals, each one filled with my mother's neat handwriting. I found the safe in the bedroom closet, punched in my birthday, and the door swung open to reveal folders stuffed with documents. I spread everything out on the floor of the workshop and began to read. For hours, as the storm finally broke outside and rain hammered against the windows, I absorbed the full scope of what Robert Dawson had done. It wasn't just fraud. It was systematic, calculated, ruthless destruction of 2 people's lives. The journals detailed every manipulation, every threat, every act of cruelty. My mother had recorded conversations with hidden tape recorders, then transcribed them word for word into her journals. She'd kept every check Robert sent, documenting the inconsistent support, the months of nothing, the way he used money as a weapon to keep her compliant. There were letters from Richard written in the months before his death, detailing his plan to expose Robert. Richard had been thorough, gathering evidence of other business dealings where Robert had used similar tactics. He'd found a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and possibly other crimes. He'd been building a case that could have sent Robert to prison. And then Richard had died conveniently before he could act on any of it. The storm was raging outside when I heard the front door open. I froze, journals still spread out around me, my heart suddenly pounding. I hadn't locked the door. I hadn't thought anyone knew about this place. I'd been so absorbed in reading that I hadn't heard a car pull up. Footsteps in the front room. Slow, deliberate. Then a voice I recognized. "So you found Mom's little hideaway. I was wondering when you'd show up here." "Mason." My brother stepped into the workshop, shaking rain from his expensive jacket. He looked around with an expression of distaste, as if the place offended him. His eyes landed on me, sitting on the floor, surrounded by evidence of our father's crimes, and he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. I scrambled to my feet, instinctively moving to block his view of the journals. "How did you know I was here? How did you even know about this place?" Mason laughed, a cold sound. "You think I didn't have you followed? The second you left Portland, I had someone on you. Dad wanted to make sure you didn't do anything stupid. And here you are digging through ancient history like it matters. It does matter." I gestured at the evidence spread across the floor. "This proves what Dad did. He stole Mom's company, had destroyed her life. He might have even killed Richard. Mason's expression hardened. Careful, Harper. You're talking about our father. About family. You don't know the whole story. Then tell me. I stepped toward him, anger overriding fear. Tell me what I don't know. Explain how any of this is justified. He moved further into the room, his eyes scanning the journals and documents with a mix of curiosity and contempt. Mom was talented, I'll give her that. But she was naive. She didn't understand business. Dad saw potential in Monroe Designs, and he did what successful people do. He took advantage of an opportunity. That's not a crime, Harper. That's capitalism. He stole from her. He manipulated her. He ruined her life. Mason shrugged. She got married, had a kid, got financial support. Plenty of women would kill for that arrangement. She was never going to make Monroe Designs into what it became. She didn't have the vision or the ruthlessness. Dad turned it into a multi-million-dollar brand. He made something great out of her little hobby. The casual cruelty in his words took my breath away. This was my brother, but he was a stranger to me. He'd been raised by Robert, taught that power and profit mattered more than anything else, that people were just resources to be used. What about Richard? I demanded. Did Dad tell you about Richard? About how conveniently he died right before he could expose the truth. For the first time, I saw something flicker in Mason's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. Or fear. That was an accident. The police investigated and found nothing suspicious. Do you really believe that? Or do you just not want to know the truth? Mason's jaw clenched. It doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is that you're sitting here going through documents that legally belong to the Dawson family estate. Everything Mom had, everything in this workshop reverts to Dad as her legal husband. Which means it belongs to us now. He moved toward the journals, reaching down to pick one up. I lunged forward and grabbed his wrist. Don't touch those. They're mine. Mom left them for me. We struggled for a moment, Mason trying to pull free while I held on desperately. He was stronger than me, but I was fighting for something that mattered. Finally, he shoved me backward hard enough that I stumbled and nearly fell. Listen to me, little sister. Mason's voice was low and dangerous now. You need to forget about all of this. Go back to Portland. Live your life. Don't make trouble for people who have the power to destroy you. Is that a threat? It's reality. Dad has lawyers, money, and connections you can't even imagine. You take this to the police or the media or anyone else and we'll bury you. We'll tie you up in lawsuits for years. We'll destroy your reputation. We'll make sure you never work anywhere decent again. And that's if we're being nice about it. I stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time how far the rot in the Dawson family went. It wasn't just Robert. Mason had been taught to think this way, to believe that power gave them the right to hurt people without consequences. Get out, I said quietly. This is Mom's house. Get out now. Mason's expression shifted, became calculating. Fine. I'll go. But you should know that Dad is coming here. He wants to talk to you himself. And trust me, Harper, you don't want to make him angry. Not if you value your safety. He left without another word, slamming the door behind him. I stood there shaking, listening to his car start and drive away. Then I ran to the door and locked it, though I knew a lock wouldn't keep them out if they really wanted in. I spent the rest of that night in a state of controlled panic, reading faster, now taking photos of the most important documents with my phone and uploading them to a cloud storage account. I made copies of everything, working by lamplight as the storm raged outside. If Mason knew about this place, if Robert was coming, I needed to secure the evidence before they could destroy it. Around 2 a.m, I found something that changed everything. It was tucked into the back of the third journal, a separate set of pages folded and tucked between the regular entries. My mother's handwriting, but different somehow. More frantic, less controlled. Dated just 3 months before she died. Harper, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you found my journals. There's something I haven't told you, something I've kept secret even in these pages because I was afraid someone else might find them. I'm dying. The doctors gave me 6 months. Cancer aggressive and already too advanced to treat. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to watch me deteriorate, didn't want to burden you with that fear and grief while I still had time to set things in motion. But I'm using this time, these last months, to make sure you have everything you need. I've been working with someone, a lawyer named Margaret Hale. She was my roommate in college, the only person I trusted with the truth about Robert. She's been helping me organize the evidence, prepare the legal groundwork for what needs to happen after I'm gone. Margaret will find you at my funeral. She'll give you the box with the key and the address. She'll be your ally in this fight, Harper, because God knows you'll need one. There's more evidence than what's in this workshop. Margaret has copies of everything stored securely where Robert can't reach them. She has contacts with investigative journalists, with law enforcement, with lawyers who specialize in corporate fraud. She's been waiting for years to help me bring Robert down. I couldn't do it while I was alive because I was too afraid of what he'd do to you. But now I'm dying anyway, and you're an adult, and it's time. I'm so sorry to leave this burden on you. I'm so sorry for all the years of poverty and struggle. I'm so sorry I couldn't be the mother you deserved. But I can give you this: the truth, the evidence, and a fighting chance to get justice. Be brave, my lion. Roar for both of us. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. My mother had known she was dying. She'd spent her last months preparing for this moment, giving me the tools to fight a battle she couldn't win herself. And she'd had help, someone I could trust, someone who'd been waiting to step forward. Margaret Hale, the mysterious woman at the cemetery. My mother's ally, and now potentially mine. I grabbed my phone and searched for Margaret Hale in Kennebunkport, Maine. Nothing. I tried Portland. Nothing. Then Boston, and there she was. Margaret Hale, attorney at law specializing in business litigation and corporate fraud. Her office was in a prestigious building downtown. It was 3 a.m, but I sent an email to the contact address on her website anyway. Subject line: Evelyn Monroe's daughter. Message: I found everything. We need to talk. The response came 20 minutes later, even though it was the middle of the night. I've been waiting for your message, Harper. I'm driving to Kennebunkport now. Don't leave the house. Don't talk to anyone from the Dawson family. I'll be there by dawn. I spent the rest of the night reading the journals cover to cover, memorizing the details of my mother's documentation. By the time the storm cleared and the first light of dawn appeared over the ocean, I understood the full scope of what Robert Dawson had done. He hadn't just stolen Monroe designs. He'd used it as a template for other schemes, other businesses he'd infiltrated and taken over. My mother's journals referenced at least 4 other companies where Robert had used similar tactics. Other entrepreneurs who'd trusted him, other dreams he'd crushed, other lives he'd ruined. Monroe Designs was just the beginning. A car pulled up just after 6 a.m. Through the window, I saw the same woman from the cemetery, now without the veil. She was in her early 50s with short gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She moved with purpose, carrying a briefcase and a large box. I opened the door before she could knock. Margaret Hale looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy, part steely determination. You look like her, she said. Your mother. Same eyes, same stubborn chin. Come on, Harper. We have a lot of work to do and not much time. Your brother has already contacted your father, and Robert is not going to wait long before he comes here himself. She came inside, set her briefcase on the workbench, and opened it to reveal more files, more documents, more evidence. For the next several hours, she explained everything. How she and my mother had met in college, bonded over their love of art, and their determination to never let men control their lives. How she'd watched helplessly as Robert destroyed her best friend's future. How she'd gotten her law degree partly because of what happened to my mother, determined to have the skills to fight men like Robert Dawson. Margaret had been gathering her own evidence for years, documenting Robert's pattern of fraud across multiple businesses. She'd been waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst, to bring everything into the open. My mother's death and my discovery of the journals were that catalyst. But Margaret also warned me about the risks. Robert Dawson has incredible power and resources. Taking him on directly could destroy your life. You need to be absolutely certain you want to do this. Because once we start, there's no going back. I thought about my mother working herself to exhaustion in that tiny apartment while Robert lived in luxury. I thought about Richard dead at 27 because he tried to do the right thing. I thought about all the years I'd believed my mother was weak when actually she'd been the strongest person I'd ever known. I'm certain, I told Margaret. Whatever it takes. I want him to pay for what he did. Margaret smiled, and it was fierce and satisfied. Good. Because I've been waiting 28 years for this. Your mother was my best friend, Harper. Let's get justice for her. We spent 2 days at the workshop organizing evidence, building a case, and preparing for what Margaret called the confrontation. She'd already been in contact with an investigative journalist at the Boston Globe who'd been researching Robert Dawson for years but had never quite had enough evidence to publish. She'd also reached out to contacts in the FBI's white-collar crime division and several lawyers who specialized in business fraud. But Margaret insisted that before we went public, I needed to face Robert directly. Not just for legal reasons, though. Getting him on record was important, but for personal ones. "You deserve to confront him," she said. "You deserve to look him in the eye and tell him you know the truth. Your mother never got that chance. You should take it." The call came on the third morning. Robert Dawson calling from a number I'd had blocked for years. I answered. His voice was smooth, cultured, completely calm. "Harper, I understand you've been going through your mother's things. I think it's time we talk, don't you? Family should work these things out together, not through lawyers and threats." "I'm listening," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "There's an old dock in Kennebunkport near the lighthouse. I'm sure you know it. Meet me there tonight, midnight. Come alone. Bring whatever documents you found. We'll discuss how to handle this situation like adults." I looked at Margaret, who was listening on speaker. She nodded. "I'll be there," I told Robert. "But I'm not giving you anything until I hear the truth from you. Until you admit what you did to Mom and Richard." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Robert laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. More than your mother ever did. Fine. We'll talk. See you at midnight." He hung up. Margaret immediately started making calls, setting things in motion. She'd have people nearby recording everything from a distance. She'd have backup in case things went wrong. But she also made sure I understood the danger. Robert is a killer, Harper. We believe that even if we can't prove it yet. He killed Richard, and he might kill you if he thinks you're a real threat. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? I thought about my mother's letter. "Be brave, my lion." "I'm sure," I said. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret coached me on what to say, how to get Robert to incriminate himself, how to stay safe if things turned violent. She gave me a small recording device to wear under my clothes and made sure I had her number on speed dial. We went over every scenario, every possible outcome. As midnight approached, another storm was moving in off the Atlantic. The wind was picking up, and the weather report warned of dangerous conditions along the coast. "Perfect," Margaret muttered. "Dramatic and distracting. Just be careful on that dock, Harper. Storm conditions make everything more dangerous." I drove to the dock alone as instructed, but I knew Margaret was nearby with her contacts from law enforcement and journalism. The dock was old and decrepit, barely maintained, used mostly by commercial fishermen who didn't care about the decay as long as the pilings held. The ocean was already churning waves, crashing against the supports with increasing violence. Two figures stood at the far end of the dock, illuminated by the single weak light that still worked. Robert and Mason, father and son, standing side by side. As I approached, clutching my mother's journal in a waterproof bag, I could see their faces clearly for the first time in a decade. Robert looked older than I, remembered his hair gone gray, his face lined with age. But his eyes were still sharp, still calculating. Mason stood slightly behind him, and I could see conflict in my brother's expression. He was afraid, I realized. Afraid of what I might know, afraid of what his father might have done. The rain started as I reached them, fat drops that quickly became a downpour. The wind was howling now, and the dock was slippery, dangerous. We stood facing each other in the storm, three members of a family that had never really been one. Robert spoke first, having to shout over the wind. "Harper, thank you for coming. I know this must be difficult for you, losing your mother and now discovering all these confusing documents. But I want you to understand the truth, the real truth, not the version your mother imagined in her grief and mental illness." "She wasn't mentally ill," I shouted back. "She was betrayed. By you." Robert sighed as if dealing with a difficult child. "Your mother was talented, I'll give her that. But she was naive about business. When I offered to help her and Richard expand Monroe Designs, I was doing them a favor. I invested money, connections, expertise. The fact that I ended up owning the company was just the natural result of my superior business acumen. You stole it." I pulled the journal from the waterproof bag, rain immediately soaking the worn leather cover. She documented everything. Every forged signature, every illegal transfer, every threat you made. And Richard knew. He was going to expose you. For the first time, Robert's calm facade cracked. His expression went cold, dangerous. Richard was weak. He would have destroyed the entire family with his self-righteous crusade. His death was unfortunate, but it was an accident. The police investigated and found nothing because there was nothing to find. Convenient, I said. Just like it's convenient that everyone who tries to stand up to you ends up destroyed or dead. Mason stepped forward suddenly, his voice desperate. Harper, please. Just give us the journals. Dad will pay you, set you up with money, make sure you're taken care of. You don't have to live in poverty anymore. You can have a real life. I looked at my brother and saw the little boy he must have been before Robert twisted him into this desperate, complicit man. For a moment, I felt sorry for him. I don't want his money, I said. I want the truth to come out. I want Mom's name restored. I want everyone to know what he did. That's when Robert lunged for me. He was faster than I expected, driven by decades of getting whatever he wanted through force and intimidation. He grabbed for the journal, his hands like claws, his face twisted with rage. All pretense of civility was gone. This was the real Robert Dawson, the man who'd killed his own brother and destroyed my mother's life. We struggled on the slippery dock, the rain blinding the wind, trying to push us over. Mason was shouting something, but I couldn't hear him over the storm. Robert's hands closed around the journal, yanking hard. I pulled back, refusing to let go. This journal was my mother's life work, her documentation of the truth. It was everything she'd sacrificed, for everything she'd waited years for me to find. Robert pulled harder, and suddenly we were both off balance. The dock was so slippery, the wood wet and treacherous. I felt myself sliding toward the edge and let go of the journal to grab for the railing. Robert stumbled backward, the journal now in his hands, that look of triumph crossing his face for just a second. Then his foot slipped. It happened so fast. One moment he was standing there victorious, the next he was falling backward toward the churning water below. His arms windmilled, the journal flying from his hands, his mouth open in shock. Then he hit the water with a splash that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the storm. Mason screamed and ran to the edge of the dock. The waves were massive, violent, driven by the full force of the storm. I saw Robert's head surface once, his face a mask of terror, his arms flailing desperately. Then a wave crashed over him and he was gone. Mason turned to me, his face pale in the weak light rain streaming down his cheeks mixed with tears. You killed him. You fucking killed him. I stared at the spot where Robert had disappeared, breathing hard, shaking from adrenaline and shock. I didn't kill him. He slipped. He grabbed for the journal and he lost his balance. It was an accident. Mason looked like he wanted to attack me, wanted to push me into the water after his father. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the sound of sirens approaching, Margaret's backup finally arriving. Maybe it was the realization that his father was gone, and with him the empire built on lies. Maybe it was just seeing the absolute determination in my eyes, the knowledge that I would never back down, never give up. He turned and ran, slipping and stumbling down the dock toward the parking lot. Within seconds, he was gone, leaving me alone in the storm with my mother's journal floating in the churning water below. I dropped to my knees on the wet dock, exhausted, terrified, and somehow triumphant. Police and paramedics arrived minutes later. They searched for Robert's body, but the storm and the current made it impossible that night. It took 2 days before they found him washed up on a beach miles down the coast. The investigation was extensive. The police questioned me for hours, took my statement, examined the dock. But Margaret was there with her evidence, with recordings of the conversation, with testimony that Robert had threatened me. And most importantly, with documentation of everything Robert had done, crimes that gave him a clear motive to have attacked me. In the end, they ruled Robert's death an accidental drowning, the result of a confrontation on a slippery dock during a dangerous storm. No charges were filed against me. But the real investigation was just beginning. With Robert dead and unable to defend himself, the media firestorm that followed was explosive. Margaret released everything to the press. The Boston Globe ran a front-page exposé on Robert Dawson's decades of fraud. Other papers picked up the story. Television news programs devoted segments to the rise and fall of the Dawson empire. Monroe Designs, it turned out, was just the tip of the iceberg. With Robert gone, other victims started coming forward. Business partners he'd betrayed, entrepreneurs he'd destroyed, competitors he'd eliminated through illegal means. The FBI opened multiple investigations into his business practices. Mason tried to fight it at first, hiring expensive lawyers and issuing statements claiming the accusations were false. But the evidence was overwhelming, and eventually he realized he was going to lose everything. The Dawson family empire collapsed in a matter of months. Assets were seized, lawsuits were filed, and Mason ended up facing his own legal troubles for his involvement in some of Robert's later schemes. For me, the legal battle to reclaim Monroe Designs took over a year. Margaret was brilliant, presenting case after case, document after document, showing clearly that my mother had been the rightful owner, that Robert's acquisition had been fraudulent from the beginning. The courts eventually ruled in my favor, returning Monroe Designs to the Monroe family. To me, I could have sold it. The brand still had value, even tainted by scandal. I could have taken the money and disappeared, started a new life somewhere, far from all of this pain and drama. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered my mother's words. Be a lion. So I moved to Kennebunkport permanently, to the house that was rightfully my mother's. I spent months cleaning it up, restoring the workshop, studying my mother's designs and techniques. I taught myself jewelry making, using her sketches and notes, watching online tutorials, practicing until my hands cramped. I reached out to the artisans my mother had worked with before Robert destroyed her life. Some were retired, some had passed away, but a few remembered Evelyn Monroe and were willing to help her daughter. They taught me the fine details of metalwork, of stone setting, of the craftsmanship that had made my mother's work special. Monroe Designs reopened 2 years after my mother's death, but it was different. It wasn't trying to recreate what had been lost. It was something new, something that honored my mother's legacy while looking forward. Today I'm standing in the flagship store of Monroe Designs in Portland, the city where my mother and I struggled to survive on her seamstress wages. The store is beautiful, all white marble and soft lighting, with my mother's designs displayed like the art they are. There's a photograph of her on the wall, young and radiant, holding up one of her early sketches. Beneath it is a plaque that reads Evelyn Monroe, founder and visionary. I still wear the locket my mother left me. Inside, I placed a small photo of her with Richard, both of them smiling and in love, before everything fell apart. And underneath it, I wrote the words she left me. A lion. I am a lion. My mother taught me that fire destroys, but it also purifies. It burns away what is false and weak, leaving only what is true and strong. The Dawson family tried to extinguish my mother's fire. Instead, they just scattered the embers. And I gathered those embers and built an inferno. This is my legacy. This is my mother's legacy. The legacy of fire. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? Have you ever discovered that the people you trusted most were the ones who betrayed you? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent and fighting back, even when fighting back seemed impossible? Tell me your story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you think about your own life and your own battles, please hit that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who needs to know that even when everything seems lost, even when the people who should love you treat you like nothing, you can still rise. You can still fight. You can still win. Remember, you are not what they made you. You are what you choose to become. Be the lion. Light your fire. And never ever let anyone extinguish it.